So there's a new pastor, Mrs. Harris, for Children, Youth, and Family, and her name's Julie McCain. And she's preaching today for the very first time. She just arrived Thursday. And then Wyatt Morden, I don't know if you know who he is. He's the choir director at Kalu.
Yes.
And
His son was Sam.
Yes. Apparently his choir is singing right now, which I did
Well,
not
no
know.
wonder.
They got 5 songs,
That
yeah.
took quite a bit
Oh,
of
my.
number of
Yeah. So, Helen, you weren't here. Were you here last week, Helen?
Ellen, were you here last week?
Here last week?
At Bible study.
No.
Okay. But
I
you
wasn't
weren't
either. I
either.
gotta watch it. on
okay,
YouTube.
Charlotte and
Yeah.
okay. And I know you weren't all. So I want to just say a couple words about last week was taught by Dr. Lisa Dahill.
She was great.
She was
Awesome.
she was so wonderful. And she is a professor at CLU in the religion department and has real heart for ecology and the land and the ethics of it. She was fantastic, and if you want to see it, you can go to
The church website.
just to the church website.
Yeah, I think that's.
And you can find it on the church website, and it's well worth listening to her do that. Now, I want to begin sort of where she left off in a way, and that she was talking about Genesis and the stories of creation that we have, and Genesis 1 and 2. And in her talk, we hear in some ways destruction of the climate, but also hope in the creation. And life does begin in a garden. And I'm going to focus more on the garden part, but probably not where everybody goes when they think garden, because I want to think about what that means and unpack it. And we could probably say she was a little more big creation focused. I'll be a little more garden focused, but this is not a class on how to plant vegetables, okay? So, but where I really wanted to begin is with the song In the Garden, which is a beautiful song all year long, but I think particularly striking here in the season of Easter as we think of the women meeting Jesus the gardener, who Lisa Dahill mentioned last week. They thought he was the gardener in that garden tomb. And this is my grandmother's favorite song. And I might just start crying hearing about it or thinking about it. My grandmother is the one who taught me how to garden. And my grandmother has a particular connection to this song, and everybody knew for years that this was her favorite song. She's been very clear with all of us that this song needs to be sung at her funeral, and she still loves this song. And Kim was awesome because I think it was for her 90th birthday. Kim played the piano, and we did a little bit different version, and I sang the song and recorded, and I sent it to her for her birthday,
cool.
which I'm pretty sure was her 90th birthday.
Okay.
She's almost 95 now,
Wow.
which is hard to believe was that long ago, but I think it was. I feel like it was for her 90th birthday.
Yeah, it was her 90th birthday.
Yes.
5 years ago.
And then at the end, even Kim said, "Happy birthday, Grandma," on the video. So it was really special to record that for her. So I want to begin by singing this. We have some more tomatoes here. These are the ones that were planted early, and they're gigantic.
Wow.
Thank you, Grant Naparella Delivery
Yeah.
Tomato Man. You're fantastic. And so we'll sing this, and then I will tell you the story that we finally, you know what, I might actually be the only one in my family who knows why she loves this song so much, because when she told me this story, she was very weepy, and it was beautiful. So let's sing
What are you going to tell us?
after we sing.
Oh, okay.
After we sing. I won't let you my grandma loves this song, and she'll tear up too. Now, this is a hymn that's over 100 years old. I have a little fact on the top. This is a particular copy I actually use here in the Ascension Garden. So these are the lyrics of the hymn song called In the Garden. It was written over 100 years ago by a man named C. Austin Miles. It has been published in over 200 hymnals. And I have to explain music books because we have students now, they're, a hymnal, what's that? And so then what I encourage the students to do is to find a place to sit and read it in the garden. They can just read the lyrics, or they can ask their teacher to listen to it on an iPad or iPhone, a good use of technology. And the version of this song we sang in chapel, which I did with Kim, was one by a group called Watermark. So it's got a little bit more of a band feel, and they put in a different little bridge that's there. So here's, now when I hear it and I imagine my grandmother, so when my grandmother talked about loving this song, my grandmother grew up in North Carolina, and she lived on a farm in North Carolina, and there was this big creek with a dam that ran through the land and separated it from some of her friends. And so there was a bridge that was near the dam, and it was a mill that would produce maybe flour or something. There was like some sort of mill there in the dam, and she would cross the bridge and go play with her friends and come back and go home to her farm. And she was about the age of Hannah, and she had gone over to see her friends, and then there was a storm, and it was pouring down rain, and she had to get home. So she's running home, and she runs across the bridge that's just in front of the dam, and she gets just across, and here's this horrific sound, and the dam broke, and the water is gushing. And so had my grandmother been just 1 or 2 minutes later, my grandmother, who did not know how to swim, would have been rushed from that water and down.
Wow.
And so she wasn't really all that shook up at the moment because she couldn't comprehend the vastness of what happened, but there was a lot of worry because there wasn't communication, and some people were realizing the dam broke, and was she okay? And she was. So about a year later, my grandmother is sitting near, they didn't repair the dam, and it had flooded a lot of area, and now the flood's gone and it's just flowing, and she's sitting out there, and it's this beautiful meadow in spring, and the grass is soft and new, and there's flowers, and there's birds, and there's butterflies, and she's just sitting out there, and it dawns on her that, like, she feels that she's in this garden alone, and the dew is still on the roses, and she hears God's voice. Makes me cry. And that she's walking with him, and he's talking with her, and that there is some reason that God wanted to make sure she wasn't swallowed up in that dam. And that she can go back to that as a pivotal moment that God had called her forth into life. And to see that, this breaking of the dam had caused some devastation, and now it was just life and beauty. And she felt like, for her, this was such a personal song of meeting God in this garden where there had once been destruction and chaos, and now there was this beautiful order to it. And because it was such a deeply intimate, personal experience, it was one that she just kind of felt odd going around and telling people, that she was very comfortable saying, oh, my favorite song's in the garden. But to be able to explain all of that, so I'm so glad that she has in recent years, so we know the significance of that. And she's also said, now that she's older, that this is what she envisions it will be like when she enters heaven. Okay, yep,
Wow.
that she will be back with Jesus in the garden. So, with that, I want to spend a little bit of time just with this question, what is a garden? Because as my grandma sat there in a meadow, she wasn't with a lot of tomato plants, okay? So when you hear the word garden, what is a garden? Like, what does that jump out to you? I want to start with our youngest ones. Hannah, when you hear garden, what's the first image or word that comes to mind? Homesteading. Okay, do you want to explain what homesteading is?
Well, I don't really like, just like the elective homesteading, which is on Fridays at school, and we usually just like garden or do fun things in the garden, or like bake or plant, or just, I don't know, do that stuff, or clean up the garden. Like yesterday, we were getting ready for the tomato sale, and we made aprons for, like, so we can wear at the tomato sale, so people can come and ask us questions about the tomatoes, and
Was that the sewing? Did I miss your sewing?
No,
Oh,
no.
okay.
No, they made the nice utility aprons for the garden so you can put in your, tools and your shovels, but they all know that they need a Sharpie and some labels in case any of the labels fall out of our tomatoes. They can relabel quick, and it marks them, that homesteading class, as a little more knowledgeable of what's happening in the garden. And then they had iron-ons of hummingbirds and ladybugs and flowers, and they could kind of decorate succulents on their aprons. And we do have a homesteading class that is an elective for 5th through 8th graders that meets every Friday from 1:30 to 3. There's other students who chose to be in sports. Or what elective are you in right now, Maddie?
I'm in creative writing.
Creative writing. And so homestead's one, and what is it to live off the land and tend the land and then create things from the land? Yes. So Delaney, when you think garden, what do you think of?
usually my mom.
Your mom? Now, do both of you go off into tomatoes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you catch like 7 tomatoes, like just the bigger things in my room for like a few weeks.
Hannah has a magical window in her room that faces south and is absolutely wonderful for seed starting and growing tomatoes. This is Delaney. Her mom is Tiffany, who works in the garden with me. So these girls know that this time of year is tomato season, and they do a lot of work. So a lot of the labeling that you see in the tomatoes is by many students at the school, but somehow Delaney and Hannah end up with most of it. And we don't finish. Maddie, what do you think of when you think garden?
Allergies and asthma.
Allergies and asthma. That is
That's true.
That is true. Yes. Though I do remember you saying, Maddie, that if you had a choice at school to spend a 40-minute class period on your iPad or a 40-minute class period out here in the Central Garden, you would pick the 40-minute class period out in the Central Garden.
That one day when we were out there for an entire class period, my allergies and asthma had no problems, and I was really surprised.
Nice.
So that was,
So we just need to do that more often for you.
yeah.
And it wasn't windy that day,
No, it was
so
not.
that probably was really helpful.
Yeah.
So what do you think of garden besides your name?
Well, I have a new discovery.
This is Mrs. Gardner,
Yeah,
for real.
Jenna Gardner.
Jenna
No, I discovered, in addition to all the, the latest stuff in my garden with the artichoke and whatever other plants, but no, the term of green pasture, or, for the Psalm 23,
Yes.
he leads us by green pasture. So I'm writing a poem about that psalm. And I go into YouTube and I'm, about what is, information about. And there is, if you Google it, there is this pastor, and the YouTube clip, it's sort of cool because he's actually over in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem area.
Ah.
And he's talking about the green pasture written in the Psalm is not a green, grassy, flowy.
Oh, it's Ray
No.
Vanderlin's, I think. Was it Ray Vanderlin? Okay,
Could
keep
be,
going.
but anyway, it's a rocky, deserty type,
Mhm.
wilderness or whatever. And it's like, oh my goodness, and then he's like, and they would, the sheep, they would have the sheep walk through this hill, and it's not green grass or anything, but there are, where you got the rocks, and then little clumps of grass would sprout up by the rock. They'd actually need a rock, to grab the water. And we're, here you think, oh, gee, a rock, really? But that, it grabs the water. And you got a whole bunch of symbolism going here with the Holy
love
Spirit
it.
and the rock, but that's where the green would come up for the sheep to graze. Yeah, so where you just think, that's up in supposedly the 23rd Psalm, that's, when there's some green pastures, lead us to,
Little tufts of green.
Yeah, so.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so, it just shows that a garden doesn't necessarily have to be, the green lush, whatever. I mean, that there
Yes.
can be, even when you do the walks here in the hills or out in Borrego Springs, Desert Palm Springs, where I used to think, oh, it's this rock and cactus or whatever, ew. But oh no, and then these plants have names, and some of them medicinal uses by the Chumash Indians or whatever. And
Yes.
it's not just a weed anymore, it's wild mustard brought in from the settlers, and hey, it has
Yeah.
a name and a purpose, and yeah,
I
so
love that.
everything, a garden, it's all around us. I don't see weed or desert, land, dead, I don't see dead anymore,
I love this.
So, anyway, I talk too much.
Anybody else? What is a garden? What do you think?
I just think of two things, because it might be, just because one of them might be interesting. The first one was, I was a little girl during the Second World War, and I grew up in Redondo Beach, and we had a huge piece of property. And we had a huge victory garden all during the
Oh.
Second World War, and that's what we ate from.
I
And
didn't realize that. Wow.
yeah, we had a huge, huge garden that I had to work in.
Wow.
At the time, I had to work in, but we all worked on
Like,
it.
how old were you? I mean, 10 or
Um,
15? I'm sorry, no, I mean,
Well, no, I was, during the war,
Okay,
8,
okay.
let's say 7 or 8,
Yeah, so, okay, yeah,
because I was 10 when the war ended.
okay.
But I was
okay,
7, 8, 9,
Okay,
so, 7, 8, 9, 10,
okay.
and we
okay,
continued the garden after too.
okay.
Wow.
But we had a huge one which fed our family, because I have 5 brothers and sisters.
Mhm.
Then the second thing, that's just personal, but the second thing is part of my spiel at Gardens of the World.
Oh, yes. She's a
you-
docent at
Yeah.
Gardens of the World.
15 years now. And I did not know this, but way back the Egyptians had the first private gardens because they love nature,
Okay.
but they couldn't go out and hike or walk in nature because of bandits and criminals. It was, we're talking the wealthy,
Mhm.
and so they had walled-in gardens so they could go out and walk. And that's where the concept of a walled-in garden came from the ancient Egyptians.
Interesting, wow.
They also had water gardens.
Okay, and that will be a good thought to hold in a little bit when we talk about gardens as a place of peace and community, because
Yes,
that's how
what
they
these
had
were.
to experience peace, was having it enclosed.
And enclosed because they weren't
Weren't
safe.
Okay. Anybody else want to share? Yeah.
I think of, just like you, Chamie, my grandmother, I grew up, she had her whole backyard was a garden, and she had a grapevine garden, as well as vegetables and kumquat tree, a fig tree, an avocado tree, and an orange tree. But I just remember as a little girl, always taking time with her, and the words that just, I remember in my mind of how, when I'm thinking of what I felt like being back there was, we worked the garden, but we did it together. We replenished the garden, we kind of cleared out the garden, but in doing that, working with each other, she always sang this song. There was just something that was rejuvenating for both of us, as well as for the garden. and it was our time. We were with each other, but we didn't really have to talk with each other. And it was just, I think of, again, she sang this song every time we were in the
Wow.
garden, every single time. But that's what, for gardening for me now, even with Emily, is when we're working, we don't necessarily have to talk, but we're like one with the garden. I know that sounds,
No,
there's something
yeah.
about getting into a garden and like we're part of that garden and I just keep thinking replenishing and refreshing my soul and nurturing a garden, and then we're nurtured because of that. And that's what
Amen.
I come up with
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
garden.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
Something healing, refreshing, it's like a drink of water, only it's,
Yeah.
it's
yes.
on the deep.
Anybody else want to share? You good? So, this sense of what is a garden, and it's a question that's come up a lot when we've thought of ascension, in particular, when we've talked about having a central garden, and yet we have these outdoor classroom space and a nature explorer program at the school, and really a lot of people, when we've talked about building this garden, are thinking several vegetable boxes. And that's not what we're thinking, is that a garden takes on many different forms, and that a garden is a place to seek peace and a place of community. And those are words that you have mentioned, minus the fact that sometimes gardens can cause us asthma and allergies in there. But what are these gardens to be? A place of peace and connection and community to God, who walks with me in the garden, and community to the people that God gives us. Now, Lisa Dr. Dayhill talked about this creation as a whole, and God hovering over the chaos and bringing forth creation. And so we have mountains, and we have oceans, and we have whales, and we have lions, and tigers, and bears, oh my, and all of that. And then God plants a garden. That's what it says in Genesis 2. God plants a garden. So he's created the whole world, and he's planted a garden. And to me, the significance of that is that the garden is this place that's on this human connection level with God. It's something that we can do to be a part of God's creation. So just stay here with me for a moment. None of us can make a mountain. Now, we might be able to build a really large pile of dirt, but we can't make mountains. None of us can create an ocean. None of us can create the clouds in the sky. None of us can create a bird. We can hatch little chicks, and Delaney has 3 adorable little chicks at her house right now. We should have brought those, Delaney. They're so cute. We can take care of baby animals, but we cannot create them. And so in the vastness of creation, God does what only God can do. And we are a part of standing in awe of that and the gift of the beauty of that. But then he plants a garden with Adam and Eve, and they are able on that human level with a God who always wants to connect with us on a human level. We talked about incarnation and God being flesh in Jesus Christ. And I think we'd have this foreshadow of God planting in the garden, because the garden is something we can do. A garden is the human level of creation. We can plant trees, and we can plant vegetables, and we can tend it and care for it. And if we're created in the image of God, then what is it for us to be in that garden and be a part of that image and do what we as humans can do in that space, and to discover so much about God. And so to really be able to think about gardens as this place that's essential to our humanity, because garden is the human place that we can really be hand in hand walking alongside God and doing that. Now, I want to also talk about a little bit of a tweak that I have been chewing on for the past year since I read this book called The Nature Fix. And it's why nature makes us happier, healthier, and more creative. This is not a Christian book, but God was speaking to me throughout this entire book because I believe when we look at creation, it's impossible not to see the author in it, though some people might try not to. And that as we learn more about the science of biology and creation, we learn more about how God does things, that science is the discovery of how God does things. Now, this particular book goes through different sections on why it's so essential to have that wild creation outdoor experience and have a garden experience as well. Now, one of the cities that is discussed here in this book is Singapore. I'm going to need my glasses. Has anybody been to Singapore in this group? Okay. Now, whenever I think of Singapore, I think, wow, really crowded and lots of people, and it's not been on my top 10 list of things to do in my life or explore, and yet now I really want to go to Singapore to see how they do their landscape. So it is a city. It is a city. But what's very intriguing is this person. There's a man in their government. His name is Lee Kuan Yew. Not positive I'm saying that right. Lee Kuan Yew, or LKY, as he's fondly known. He planted a public tree in a traffic circle soon after he took office, setting off what would become a personal obsession. Singapore was soon importing thousands of trees and hiring small armies of arborists and horticulturists. He launched a, quote, garden city plan that later morphed into a more ambitious city in a garden vision. So as a governmental leader on Singapore, he decided that right now in Singapore, for every hardscape that is added, you have to have more greenscape that's added. It's part of their national law to do that. And so he wanted to create his vision, a city in a garden. Now, I've been thinking about this in different contexts. We usually talk about, oh, I'm going to have a garden at my home. Or we're going to have a garden here on the church campus. Or, oh, there's a garden in front of the TO library, which is a great little place to walk through if you haven't done that, by master gardeners and everything's labeled. But places talk about creating gardens. So this hospital's going to have a little garden. This school's going to have a little garden. This home's going to have a garden. Now, God never started with giving us a house in a city. God started with creation as a whole and a garden and put people in the garden. So what would happen if we started thinking about that our home is in a garden and that our church is in a garden? How would that possibly make things different? That little bit of tweak that is as Ascension expands and does this master plan, are we a church that has a garden, or are we a church built in a garden and in the midst of God's creation? How do you think it makes it different when we think of it that way? Any tangible ways you think it might make it different?
You start seeing it now, if it's a church in a garden, now I wanna say it's, for that to be true, the garden part almost needs to be more of a 60% and the church or the building, the man-made stuff is more 40% or less. You know, so you got a little bit, you got more green, you feel like, wow, there's a garden, oh yeah, and then there's the church. Where if it's the other way around, now you got more, you know, man-made structure, you know, building stuff, and then that's the overpowering 60%, oh yeah, then the garden is now 40 or something like that, so, you know,
And it would
Yeah.
also, yes, totally, and it
Yes.
would mean that there wasn't just one central garden place with the whole
oh yeah,
campus
yeah,
becomes
it's encircling, it's
something.
encompassing, and even bringing inside. When you look at it or go through a magazine or something in Sunset, or you're looking at interior photos, and it's like, wow, that's a really neat room. What is it about this room that I could live there? I like that room. It's plants. And and you know, if you got wooden and woven stuff and such, oh my goodness, a room that has the outdoors brought in, suddenly now you're feeling, yeah, I'm relaxed, I'm at peace. I can live in this room. And so it's the neat thing when, you know, when I do my, you know, interior, it's like, okay, let's bring in the outdoors in. And when outside, let's go ahead and bring some furniture pieces outside, you know, so you go ahead and, you know, you got your chairs and maybe a rug and a table, and oh my
Yeah.
goodness, now the outside feels like it's, you know, or the you know, you can live out here too, is looking at that 60-40, you know.
I
that
love
we're
that,
going.
and I love that you talked about the interior, because I was
Yeah.
thinking, I sat here last week and I loved Dr. Dayhill, and I thought, why don't I spend more time with her? She's fantastic. And but I was sitting here in this room and I'm like, why don't I like this room? And there's different reasons we could say, but then I started thinking about why is it that I don't like this room? And I sat, you know, here yesterday going, every time I come in here, I don't like this room. And you could say, oh, you know, we need new carpet or that, and you know, we need new there.
No green,
There's one window.
yeah.
There's one window in this room. There is not even a fake plant
Yes.
in
Yeah,
this room.
Yeah,
Not even a fake plant. If you look at the pastor's offices, and I have wondered this since the day I came and first saw Tim's office 15 years ago, their windows are literally this wide, and they're about this long. Tim, as the senior pastor, he's got 2 windows. And he used to have one, which is Pastor Steve's office, Pastor's Julie's. There's same little tiny windows in these offices, little tiny windows upstairs. And you think, we as created people of God, connected to nature, our church staff, nobody looks out a window.
wow.
That's what I thought, why it was depressing when they built that junior high with no windows.
Yes,
Yeah.
There are
yes,
no windows in it.
with no window.
Students
And-
learn better.
And they do, they learn better. So if our home is in a garden, if our church is in a garden, if our schools are in a garden, then we think of nature all around. And to me, it's a humbleness and a humility to the God who first created. And there's beautiful and wonderful things about landscape and architecture, and how do we do that? But also, how do we, when we're building, not think just of the green space and the plants in the garden, but what is the integrity for all of creation? Dr. Dayhill mentioned, you know, you look at all of these Christian nations, these first world countries, who are these biggest consumers of fossil fuels and all that, and I think, well, shouldn't the church, in love with this creator God who gave us this creation and made us a garden, should we not be leading the way? Shouldn't every church have solar power? We have had people come here to this campus that said, if we gutter that sanctuary roof correct, we can get enough water on just an average rainy year and have a well and water the central garden for the whole entire year. And what is our ethical call to perhaps do that? Because we're not a bunch of buildings with some land. Our whole world is a wild creation and these more gardens that we can hold on to that we're in, and how do we start change that even in cities like Singapore. So one of the things it mentioned about Singapore that I thought was really interesting, now if I can find the rest of my quotes that I don't. They talked about a hospital that they have in Singapore that said it's rooms face a courtyard, dense trees and shrubs are there, there's ponds. It's a hospital in a garden that's in Singapore. Plants draped over balconies on each floor, giving the impression the building had just risen from the jungle floor. We call it the hospital in a garden, said chief gardener of the hospital, Rosalind Tan, who is sometimes called Madame Butterfly. And we walked by blooming hibiscus, popular with tiny golden sunburn. We know from practical experience that people enjoy greenery, and we try to create a healing environment for patients so they can have lower blood pressure and be in better condition to see the doctor. We walked through the spotless ICU where every patient in intensive care has a view of trees out 6-foot windows. At many points, corridors and landings open to the outdoors. I noticed that none of the usual antiseptic hospital smell, despite the place having one of the lowest hospital-acquired infection rates that there are. I was reminded of a 2012 study from Portland, Oregon hospital showing that rooms with better ventilation from outside garnered more diverse bacterial profiles and fewer bad bacteria. And they even say now that one of the reasons that a lot of scientists argue that our children have more autoimmune diseases is because they don't dig in the dirt and they're not outside, and how essential that is. And all people, whether we're young or old, need to be outside. I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to hand out a couple things. One from Micah, and this is the Message translation in Micah about gardens. Thank you, Steve, behind you. Oh, and then two more for you guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's our homework.
You can give one to Charlotte. Thank you, Hannah.
Chamie, who wrote the book, The Nature Fix? Do you know off the top of your head?
Florence Williams, and there's those. Yeah, Florence, is that right? Yeah, Florence Williams.
All right, thank you.
So I want to look at this passage in Micah briefly. This is Eugene Peterson's translation. But when all is said and done, God's temple on the mountain, firmly fixed, will dominate all mountains, towering above surrounding hills. People will stream to it, and many nations set out for it, saying, "Come, let's climb God's mountain. Let's go to the temple of Jacob's God. He will teach us how to live. We'll know how to live in God's way. True teaching will issue from Zion, God's revelation from Jerusalem. He'll establish justice in the rabble of nations and settle disputes in faraway places. They'll trade their swords for shovels, their spears for rakes and hoes." That's our swords into plowshares. "Nations will quit fighting with each other, quit learning how to kill one another. Each man will sit under his own shade tree. Each woman in safety will tend her own garden. God of the angel army says so, and he means what he says." And so this vision in the midst of war and desolation during this time in history, that those swords will become garden tools, this place again of peace, that will be able to sit under a shade tree, to be able to tend a garden, that it's a place of peace and a place of community. And so, thinking of all ages, but in particular our children, this is a quote that I use again and again and again. You might have heard me use, but it really is, I think there's a few things probably that each person has that's sort of your life guide that God gave you as your call to do. Like my quote from St. Irenaeus, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive," and that is what God has really placed in my heart, and I go back to and go back to. I think that my family, that myself, that the people I've called to love and be in community with, we can't be fully alive if we're not connected to God's wild creation and connected to God's gardens. And basically 4 main practices make us human. Using fire, creating and using complex tools, including writing, tilling the soil, engaging in ritual and ceremony, including storytelling. This means that the love of story is part of what makes us human. It is innate and it helps us to survive. We need fire and we need to hunt, to gather, to fashion clothes, and to till the soil for our physical survival. While ritual and storytelling now may seem unnecessary for the survival of the soul, they are necessary for the survival of the soul. And this paragraph I love. Think of the lives of so many children today. Do they get much of what helps their soul and their humanity survive? Do they sit around campfires? Do they have candlelit dinners? Can they garden? Do they learn to draw, to whittle, to knot, to weave, to sew, to fashion things of clay? Do they get to hear great stories? Many children receive so little of what nourishes their soul that it seems as though they turn from a positive expression of their humanity to a destructive one. They grasp fire, but it becomes arson. They want to use tools, but the tools become guns. They want to till the soil, but their world is paved over. Or their parents are so scared to, God forbid, let them go out and climb a tree and go to somebody's house down the road. Something that all of us on this side of the room did, and they don't necessarily get to do. Let's see. So there is less and less ritual and structure in their family life, so they seek the ritual and structure of gangs. Such children are clearly grasping for their humanity, but it seems we do not know how to help them find it. Which leads me to this next couple pieces I want to talk about in Nature Fix, which is a very scientific book, but oh my goodness, does it speak God's truth. So there is a section in here that is all about sounds. And the largest and scariest study to date looking at noise pollution and children's cognition, funded by the European Union and published in The Lancet in 2005, researchers followed several thousand children attending elementary schools near major airports in the United Kingdom, Spain, and the Netherlands. They found significant impacts on reading comprehension, memory, and hyperactivity. The results were this. For every 5 decibel increase in noise, reading scores dropped the equivalent of a 2-month delay. So that kids were almost a year behind in neighborhoods that were 20 decibel louder. And so they're talking about all the different non-nature noises, and then it goes on to talk about the noises of screens. Beep, beep, all the different games and that you play. Can you play some ugly noises for us? Okay. So, even though we might not hear screams like that, the way our bodies are hearing so much of the sound of screens and the digital age, it's the feeling you had when you heard that. They're doing these measurements when people are hearing different sounds. So measurements on the stress levels in our bodies, measurements on heart rate, breathing rate, and it's when sounds like that and these screen sounds and these airplane sounds and all these other sounds are entering our body when we may not even realize it is tense. And so it talks about the significance of nature as that we need to think of nature as sound medicine. Sound medicine. So that when you hear the sound, now let's be real, some birds don't have the prettiest of sounds. Crows are not pretty. But when you hear the sounds of birds and wind through the air and water gurgling, that there is a different sort of feeling in us and how essential that is. And then our other place is images, images, images. So they did all these studies of images and said that that viewing nature employs the mind without fatigue. It exercises, it tranquilizes us, yet enlivens us. And thus, though the influence of the mind over the body, it gives the effect of refreshing rest and revigoration into the whole system. And so what they're doing in many places, this book talks about schools that are having students face outside in the classroom, go on walks outside, be outside more, and that our kids need two kinds of outside. They need the garden outside, which is in a sense that more human controllable space, but they also need the wild beyond the garden, and that we do have more garden programs that are a good thing, increasing in schools, but how often are our kids out there in the wild? And that wild part of God and that wild part of nature forms and shapes us so much. I had the blessing of studying for a semester on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation when I was at seminary. And when you're 14, you meet with the elders and you pray in the sweat lodge, and then you are out in the wilderness for 3 days on a vision quest. And I would imagine that if I said something like that to most parents at Ascension Lutheran School of our 7th and 8th graders in confirmation, they'd be like, unless they were in a more controlled Boy Scout group, maybe. Though I've known a lot of Scout parents who are tracking their kids on GPS and freaking out about where they are in the woods. And so they do this, and that was the Lakota story. You go for 3 days, and it's about connecting to God, and it's scary in a way, because that creation, it's not a garden, it's not more controllable, it's all the animals of the wild, and yet what you discover, and then you go back and you meet with the elders after. What is that? What would it look like if our confirmation program wasn't always indoors and in books, but we sent kids out in the wildness of God's creation for 3 days? I don't know. I might have people freaking out. I've been seriously contemplating sending my boys for 3 days, just go wild somewhere and do that. You can when you're older, okay? And so the space of wildness and the space of a more tended garden, how both of those are so important. And this book also mentions for adults that they're really having to pull people out of it, because what people, in her preface, she says, and I think this is so true, we don't experience natural environments enough to realize how restored they can make us feel. Nor are we aware that studies also show that they do indeed make us healthier, more creative, more empathetic, and more apt to engage with the world and each other, more apt to be places of peace and connection. Nature, it turns out, is good for civilization. And so places like South Korea and Japan that have really super high suicide rates, work, they're sending people out on trains to go forest bathe, and they're finding that it's really changing their physicalness and their mental part and how incredibly important that is. I think I was actually gonna show a little clip that we're gonna run out of time for, so I'm just gonna introduce this to you and encourage that you might, is that on now? Did it go off?
No, I turned off the light.
Oh, good, okay.
See,
That
take
was
it
good.
slow.
Perfect, thank you.
Let's see. So this is a TED Talk that you can watch, which kind of leads into next week. Dr. Dayhill will be doing the first part, and then people can walk out to the garden. Next week at the end of class, Dr. Dayhill will bring people, and it's the weekend of the official tomato sales. As we close here today, if you want to buy a few tomatoes here early, you can. And so this is Fred Banson, and we'll watch just his introduction. If we have sound. Well,
On graduation, most of my classmates ended up in a place like this, in a congregation of people. I ended up in a congregation of plants. That's not the whole truth. There were also some people involved. I was hired by a small Methodist church to start a community garden in the rural Piedmont area of North Carolina. The garden was called Anathoth, and we took our name and our mission from the book of Jeremiah, to plant gardens and eat what they produce, and to seek the peace of the city. We saw planting gardens and seeking peace as really symbiotic activities. Exactly the kind of thing that a church should be doing, sort of like planting marigolds with your tomatoes. We were given land, and we soon turned an acre into
just a little.
a lush garden of biointensive beds. We planted blueberry bushes, had all kinds of fresh vegetables. We dug a well, we built a barn. We built a high tunnel passive solar greenhouse so that we could grow year-round. And when our members joined, we invited folks from all around the community to join, and when they joined, they would work several hours a week in exchange for their produce. It was sort of a co-op. People came from all around, and Anathoth quickly became known as a community gathering place where everyone was welcome. We had Spanish-English classes. We started a youth program, and we hosted bi-weekly potlucks. We brought the gifts of the garden to the church, blessing the seed and soil on the altar. And we brought the gifts of the church out to the garden, sharing the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper right out among the beds of collards and kohlrabi.
So you can look him up, Fred Banson's Soil and Sacrament TED Talk, and watch it if you feel interested at the time, and pray about it. Pray what Ascension Lutheran Church might do with this. Fred Banson does not direct this garden anymore. He is ordained. He was here at this Methodist Church. He teaches at Wake Forest Divinity School now. And if I was to go back to seminary today, I would go back to Wake Forest because they have a track for pastors now to get your MDiv in ecology and helping your congregation connect with the earth and in saving our planet. How, as congregations, are we stewards and we save this planet and we're connected, and that we connect with everyone, including the most maybe marginal in our communities, like having these Spanish-English classes. I always think when I stand in the garden and I look at the apartments all around here, multi-million-dollar homes this way, apartments this way, Ascensions is the crossroad, and why can't people in these apartments be using our garden for their barbecues and their potlucks? Why can't they be coming here to learn how to grow tomatoes in pots on their patio? Why can't we have spaces where they can come and pick the oranges from our trees? What does that mean? And so if I was going to seminary now, I would be getting that MDiv at Wake Forest, and that's what he's leading, is helping churches do that across the country so that churches can seek peace and community. So let us pray. God, thank you for the beauty and the wildness of all of creation, and that you meet us in gardens that help us in our humanness and our limitedness, since we can't build mountains or create oceans, that we can water and tend and grow plants. And may we always feel you walking with us in the garden. Help us in our each and day individual lives to see you in the beauty of outdoors and to find our bodies and minds and souls nourished outdoors, and also help us as a congregation, as Ascension Lutheran Church and School, to be a church in a garden and to know what that might look like and mean as we dream and vision and plan and make tangible steps into the future. And finally, I ask that you bless all the work of little preschool hands to high school hands that have planted seeds and tended these tomatoes, and that the sale be a way for everyone to enjoy your good creation, and for the garden ministry to be able to grow and thrive. And that at the end of the day, when people see a tomato, they see you, God. We say all of this in the name of Jesus Christ. So if anybody wants some tomatoes,
Yes.
I'm Janet, I'm thinking you might want